Thank you everyone for joining the next instalment of our Grassland Management series. This session today, we're going to be focusing on how to manage your grasslands for wading birds. So presenters is going to be me firstly. So hi, I'm Joseph. I'm from Nidderdale National Landscape and I'm the Grassland Conservation Officer. So I work with community groups, landowners and land managers to help manage their grasslands better for nature. And amazingly, we've got Lee Marshall from the Wildfowl Wetlands Trust. And Lee has really kindly offered some time to give us some real world experience of the principles that I'm going to describe in the first half of this webinar. He's going to talk about those principles in action. And he's got years and years of experience, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what he's got to say. So the contents of the session, for my part, I'm going to be describing what wading birds are. So we're going to go back to basics. The threats to wading birds in the modern climate through agricultural intensification. How we can help waders at like a local and national level, and how you can get involved locally with the Darley Beck Curlew project. And Lee can potentially explain different ways you can get involved more nationally with the Wildfowl Wetlands Trust and at their nature reserves dotted around the country. Right, so let's get into it. So as I said, we're going to go back to basics and we're going to learn what a wading bird actually is. So they're associated with wet habitats, whether that be on the shorelines or in the interior of the isles. They're associated with wet habitats with standing water and soft ground. The general features include the long legs. This is generalizations, but they've got long legs so they could deal with the wet ground. And long bills to help them probe the ground, searching for foods and invertebrates below ground. However, like the species on the left, lapwings do break this generalization. And things like lapwings and golden plovers, they're actually hunting aquatic invertebrates that are swimming in the water or on the water's surface. But a lot of wading birds as well have a long bill and they'll be probing the mud flats or the soft wet rush pastures, looking for those below ground invertebrates. Say they winter on the coasts and then they come inland to breed. We do have resident waders that do that all within the British Isles, but then some come from further afield like Scandinavia. So they winter over there and then they'll come and breed in the interior of the British Isles. Some are really, really long lived. And just before the webinar, I was looking and the oldest recorded oyster catcher was 41 years old. So they're really long lived. And this can be a bit of an issue when, because they're quite loyal to where they breed, and land use change can be massive over 20, 30 years. And they're quite loyal to the field in which they was born or first bred in, and the practices happening in those fields can change drastically to the detriment of them, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But just a flavour of the species we're going to talk about. We're going to curlews and golden plovers, redshank, dunlin, lapwing and oyster catchers. So the two species on the left, two species on the right, they're sticking to that description of long legs, long bill, probing the ground, and then you've got your lapwing and your curlew in the middle there. That a little bit more of a compact bird, probably a little bit more acrobatic in the air. And as I said, they're aiming for aquatic invertebrates, like swimming in the water and around the water's edge. Nidderdale National Landscape is nationally important for wading birds. It's a hot spot. And so any work that we can do to improve habitats here will be really, really beneficial. And the benefits will not only be seen here, but in the wintering grounds as well on the coast. So they occupy a variety of habitats, specifically in Nidderdale. We're getting purple moorgrass and rush pastures. So they're kind of like on your upland fringes. They can have, they can be dominated by rushes, big component of them, which are managed through grazing, big extensive areas of soft underfoot ground with maybe some standing water. They are found in hay meadows as well, so you've got to be careful when they're nesting there to ensure you're mowing sensitively around them. Bog and moorland, kind of an extension of the purple moorgrass and rush pasture on the tops and the plateaus of the hills around. And trickily, they do tend to, and this is an issue with because they're long-lived and they're loyal to their breeding grounds, that they do nest in semi-improved and improved grasslands, such as fields that are mown several times a year for silage. And we'll go into a bit more detail how you can actually look out for that and try and make those improved and semi-improved grasslands as best as we can for them. So what are the threats to wading birds? Well, there are many of them are on the red list. They are red list species and their numbers are declining, not just nationally, but worldwide. And some of the threats that are happening was just their general behavior. So as they nest on the ground, they're susceptible to disturbance, human disturbance, mowing, grazing, just dogs, and just general disturbance. But they're also quite vulnerable to predation as well, whether that be avian predation or stoats, foxes, corvids. Intensification of mowing and grazing. So the time of year that's mowing is happening earlier and earlier, and they might do several silage cuts through the year, potentially running over nests and killing chicks. With grazing, you're going to have high numbers of livestock in small areas. It's quite intense, and the livestock can trample eggs. Soil compaction, it impacts the abilities for species like curlew and other probing waders to actually find food. Soil compaction can come from overstocking fields, and so lots of trampling by livestock actually compact the ground, or intensification of mowing, like moving heavy vehicles over fields that can all compact the soil. And draining wet habitats is a big thing with agricultural intensification. Lots of field drains, so you can get on the fields earlier in the year, you can get more grass growth, and you can get higher productivity. But those wet habitats are real strongholds for waders. And so this is a report from the JNCC from May 2025, and you can see species like curlew have had drastic declines in their populations over a short space of time, over 25%. And oyster catchers and redshanks, thankfully, they're either declining trends or the populations are relatively stable. And I think without the work of people like Lee, I think those trends would closely match the curlew. So it shows that the work that we can do does benefit these species. So going to go through a few different ways in which we can help waders now. Firstly, we're going to go and talk about mowing. So as they nest on the ground, they're vulnerable to disturbance and can be killed. So different ways you can actually mow a field to counteract these potential outcomes. Most importantly, just do all your field activities outside of the breeding bird season, which roughly runs from April to July, whether that be harrowing, rolling, mowing. Try and do these activities outside of the breeding bird season. So the chicks have fledged, and you should potentially remove all the risk of damaging nests and fledglings at that point. If you do have to mow your field early and you know the chicks haven't fledged, locating the nests and creating a 20-meter buffer around those areas through something like temporary electric fencing can be a real helpful way to not damaging the nest or the fledglings. We're going to talk a little bit about, with the Darley Beck Curlew project, how to locate those nests as well. If you've got several fields, you need to do some mowing early on in the season, mid-June. And you can do some other fields later in the year, say mid-July and later. Stagger mowing those fields allows chicks and adults to move from the fields you are mowing into the areas where there's longer vegetation so they can get in and hide from predators. So you don't need to do all your fields at once if you can possibly stagger them. Even better would be to leave unmown margins around the fields. This allows the chicks to get out of the short mown vegetation and get away from predators in the longer margins. It doesn't have to just be a linear margin around the edge. It can be like corners of fields as well. With a push for increased productivity and modernization of vehicles, improving lighting and GPS systems, farmers can mow longer into the day and into the night, but avoiding mowing at night is really important, as the birds are more vulnerable at that time. And you can mow in a friendly way, and we're going to talk about that on the next slide in a little bit more detail. So this method of mowing has come from the Northern Upland Chain Local Nature Partnership. Going into this in a bit more detail, step 1, you can mow slowly around the field at least 4 times, but it can be more. And what you're going to do is you can create a nice clean break that any fledglings in the interior of the field can escape out of. If you're going to leave an unmown margin, you want to bring that, instead of the diagram, bring it a little bit closer to the interior. Once you've mown around the outside to create a clean area for the chicks to escape, you can divvy up your field in 2, mowing it in half. And when you want to work your way outwards towards the edges in a circular pattern, nice and slow, keeping your eye out for chicks as you're doing this, because they don't always play ball and you might have to stop and move them along or mow around them. But any chicks that are in the interior of that field will be pushed out. And then if you've staggered your mowing, they can escape into other fields, or if you've left an unmown margin, they can get down in that unmown margin. So that's mowing. We're focusing on grazing. This can be grazing your meadow or grazing a pasture. A purple moorgrass rush pasture is a perfect example of a habitat type that is predominantly mown and predominantly managed through grazing. So these sorts of tips and tricks I'm going to tell you now work for those habitats. So removing grazing completely would actually negatively impact that environment for waders, because having that diverse vegetation structure really benefits them. They've got short open sward for them to actually see predators, feed. In the mornings when they're covered in dew, they can get out into the sunshine and the wind and dry off, but then they've got that tall vegetation as well to hide behind, cuddle up at night so they're not too cold, and hide away from predators. So having diverse structures is important. So grazing is an important element. It's just when and how to do it. Just like with mowing, try and graze outside the breeding bird season if possible. But for example, if you've got your meadows and you're shutting them up from April to July to grow, the livestock have got to go somewhere. And at this point, you want to graze your habitat with a light touch approach. And I'll talk a little bit more about livestock units and the densities of livestock. One thing that my colleague Matt, you might know him from Kathy the Curlew, one thing he's been learning from different landowners is actually you can force your waders into specific fields using your animals. So the springtime, when, for example, curlew are coming to the fields, actually having livestock in the fields that you don't want them to nest in because they're the fields you're going to be mowing earlier in the year. You can actually force waders into more appropriate fields for them. As I said, they're quite loyal to the breeding grounds and they might resist to this, but just stick at it. And it has been proven to save chicks and increase fledging rates. So it's about too many animals at the wrong time. And sheep have been known to eat eggs, potentially, this is not super often, but potentially because of nutrient deficiencies. So it's important to have like your nutrient licks and your nutrient blocks for your livestock so they resist that. In terms of the light touch approach, it's very light touch. So it's 1 cow per hectare, or 5 lowland ewes and lambs, or 7 store ewes and lambs. So that's a ewe with their lamb. So that's 14 individuals in that top instance. But it's really low levels of grazing. This works better on a purple moorgrass and rush pasture because they're usually extensive areas of habitat rather than enclosed fields. And usually when you're grazing your meadows, you're outside of that breeding bird season anyway. But more farmers are kind of transitioning to having a standing hay crop, not necessarily mowing the meadows. Treating them as meadows is allowing them to grow through April to July, but then actually grazing those fields off. So if you're grazing it early into like April and May, you just need to be careful and assess where the waders are on your fields at that time. So we've not grazing off. We're going to look at creating and protecting wet areas. Just want to caveat this with saying, if you're creating ponds and scrapes within semi-natural habitats or protected landscapes, an environmental impact assessment is required. If you're wanting to do something like that, get in touch with me and we can talk more about the EIA process. So wet areas are really, really important as feeding grounds. And the more, and water brings life. So the more of these areas you can get, the more waders it'll support, usually. So you want to find your depressions, your flat areas and your hollows on your land. Try and identify suitable soil types. If it's clayey, it's free. If it's clayey with a high water table, when you're starting to dig down, you're going to reach the water table early. Or if it's the right soil type with like clay and silt, any rainwater will be able to collect there. Sandy soils and loamy soils aren't suitable for pond creation. And anywhere where it's particularly steep, you're going to have to bank walls and there's more chance of it being compromised. So try and look for flat areas where possible. Scrapes aren't that big actually, 20 meters squared and no deeper than 45 centimeters, with gently sloping edges, not steep sided edges. When you've got gently sloping edges, a greater diversity of aquatic vegetation can actually persist there as well. If you can link multiple scrapes to one another, that's even better. The excavated material, especially if you're going to do a deeper pond, you want to make that as flat as possible, because while waders are feeding, they also need to keep an eye out for predators. This picture on the left is typical of a purple moorgrass and rush pasture. As you can see in that picture, you've got a diverse mix of vegetation structures. The bright green is the short sward, and then the darker, more forest green are your rushes. You've got areas to hide away from predators and keep warm over the night time, and areas to dry off, bask in the sun, and more easily probe the ground looking for food. So rushes are an important component of this habitat, but they can dominate, and you can manage it through mowing or top it, so you can mow or top them. Once again, just try and do all these activities outside of the breeding bird season, and you're reducing disturbance. And disturbance isn't just running over eggs or killing chicks, it's separating chicks from their parents who struggle to reunite as well. When you're mowing, try not to do it as a checkerboard with straight lines. Create nice, irregular, amorphous shapes. Think of like a kidney bean area, lots of little kidney bean areas, maybe 30, 40, 50 meters squared, connected to one another with arteries or swathes. So it's one continuous connected habitat. And you can graze those areas after mowing, which will further help keep the rushes back and stop them from dominating. You're going to graze after you're mowing and you've done it outside the breeding bird season. Just ensure that you're not putting too many stock on in the wetter months, because you can start to poach the ground, which can cause compaction. Now we want to reduce disturbance as well, whether this be you own a bit of land and it's your agricultural activities, or whether you just enjoy in Nidderdale and going for a walk. So yeah, disturbing waders can separate chicks from the parents, and it makes them more susceptible to predation. So just simply separating the parent and chick is enough to have a detrimental effect. So if you're driving around your landscape, if you're mowing and doing your tractor work, or you've got your quad bike, try and stick to specific routes, as the wading birds will have noticed that earlier on in the spring and would have nested and feed in areas where you weren't seen originally. So stick to specific routes. Please, 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 if you're walking in the uplands, you need to keep your dogs on leads. It's not necessarily that the dogs are finding the chicks and killing them actively, but they're just scaring the chick and separating them from the parents. So you really got to keep your dogs on leads at this time of year. Keeping the livestock out of the fields where they're nesting, you just don't want to trample on them. And all your activities just need to be outside the breeding bird season, ideally. So my final point I want to go through today is improving soil health. Everything is the foundational part of everything is the soil. So if you've got healthy soils, you're going to have healthy populations of soil invertebrates, and that's plenty of food for your waders. If they're less compacted as well, it's more easily, waders can feed more easily. So farmyard manure, when you're spreading that, you're incorporating organic matter into the soils, which then worms can incorporate further down, and you're just producing a really healthy environment for soil invertebrates to thrive. You don't want to add too much manure, but I think it's around about 9 to 12 tons per hectare is the guidance for low input grassland. So somewhere around there. Try and spread the farmyard manure as evenly as possible, and you want to spread it outside of the breeding bird season again. I was doing some research online, and it's quite varied around the best time, but probably in the autumn, August, so August, September, October, before it's getting really rainy. You don't want to add too much. You don't want to add your farmyard manure when it's about to chuck it down, because it's going to leach all the nitrates and all the nutrients out of the farmyard manure, and you're not going to get the benefits. But you don't want to spread it too early. So you don't want to spread it in like this, maybe like Feb or March, because then if it's not incorporated enough, that can actually impact your hay crop. So you need to do a little bit of research yourself on the areas, but I've read that kind of autumn time is a good time to do it. So if you're sticking to specific routes and you're not overstocking fields, you're not going to compact the soil, and you're going to improve the soil health. And the taller vegetation grows, the deeper the rooting depth of those plants are. You're creating a nice friable soil that's allowing water to infiltrate, and you're banking water over the wetter months. So if you're getting a drought, you've still got some retained soil moisture, allowing soil invertebrates to thrive. I said this was the last one, but I jumped the gun. Finally, it's supporting invertebrates, because that's what the wading birds are feeding on. More invertebrates means more food. So having that varied vegetation structure allows insects to overwinter, so they can emerge in the springtime right where you want the waders to feed. So by leaving unmown areas or incorporating grazing into a habitat that was previously ungrazed will allow you to have those vegetation structures, providing areas for overwintering individuals, and also species such as St. Mark's flies require taller vegetation to kind of chill out on and mingle and mate. So having that varied vegetation structure is really important. You want to support early and late flowering plant species, which invertebrates require for pollination and for their nectar sources. So this can be you can mow areas a bit earlier in the year, mow areas later in the year if you can collect some wildflower seed. Choosing species that have early and later flowering times is brilliant. And it's about having a mix of not just wildflowers, but grasses, sedges, and rushes as well. Lots of species of invertebrates require a grass at their grub stage or the caterpillar stage whilst they're growing. So it's not all about wildflowers. Grasses are important as well. So if you want to get involved locally, the Darley Beck Curlew Project is an amazing conservation organisation led by volunteers, kind of in the middle to south part of Nidderdale. It's a FIPL funded project. They're working with local residents and farmers to protect wading birds. So some farmers have been joined up to the project who know they've got wading birds nesting in their fields. The volunteers locate and protect nest sites with thermal imaging drones. So if you're a bit techie as well, this can be right up your street. And once volunteers have located the nests in the fields, those 20-meter buffer areas are erected around the field, erected around the nests, and those chicks and that nest will be protected for as long as possible. So if you want to get involved, the email address is there. And if you don't get that right now, don't worry. We'll be sending an email around later, and I'll have all the information on it. So that's everything from me for now. I'm going to pass you on to Lee to give us some real world experience of all that. I'll stop sharing, Lee, and you can give it a go.
That's great. Thanks, Joseph. That's right. Let me just work out to share my slideshow. So it's just working its magic. There we go. Can you see that okay?
Yeah, that's brilliant.
Cool. Okay. Hi everybody. My name's Lee Marshall. So my job now is I manage and oversee all the management of WWT reserves across the country. And you can see a map there with all the different reserves. And before that, I've literally spent my whole life protecting waders, working on reserves all over the country, from all the way down in the fens to parts of Shetland in Scotland. So I've got a kind of a sweep of experience, and I always found now with managing these reserves that I'm still a tourist. So every site has its uniqueness. Each species has its uniqueness to the site. So I'm here to kind of just give you a bit of my thoughts about individual species, and then hopefully you can gather that and from Joseph's amazing talk just now, kind of just work out what the best is for your bit of land, for the species. But I think if you had to choose one species, that's probably the most difficult to have is waders. And if you've got them on your land, you're doing a really, really good job. So you know, take my hat off to you, because over the years they're amazing to have, but they are very fussy, and yeah. So I work for WWT, and I'll just do a bit of talk about who we are and what we do. We've got 10 sites across the country, we've got SPAs, European sites, we've got triple SIs on our sites, and as you can see, they're across the whole country. And it was all founded by Sir Peter Scott, and he was the son of Robert Falcon Scott, and his pioneering sort of aspiration was to protect wetlands conservation. So he's famous for the nene, bringing that back almost from extinction. And he was also just, you know, one of our greatest inspirations, where he found solutions. He found ways of doing stuff where anybody else was not doing, and he was just an iconic conservationist. So that's who we are. And why do we choose wetlands? So, you know, wetlands are amazing, and they're all sort of part of storing carbon. They help reduce flooding. We love going out and walking along wetlands, and they're fantastic for biodiversity. So wetlands are very good, and for me, they're brilliant because you can quickly make them, and they're very good for impatient people, because if you dig a pond within 3 weeks, they could become this amazing nature, with dragonflies buzzing around, frogs and toads coming in. And when I've seen wetlands created on a large scale, you suddenly have passageways of stopping in, feeding. So they're very quick. Things can happen very quickly with wetlands. And I don't know if much of you have been around the fens, but it's the sort of the highest point is probably about 5 meters. So, but you know, we're all working on a landscape style habitat, and wetlands and grasslands typically occur below 200 meters. So that can range from marshland, from sort of up by the coast, that can, you know, sort of low swales between in the glens, and through areas that have been lost through drainage or agricultural improvement. So little grasslands can basically come in most places. I thought what I'd do is I would start with spring, as we're all having this amazing spring with lovely sunny weather. Birds are all doing their stuff, and insects are all buzzing about, because you know it is the time of year where we do enjoy the fruits of our labour. And but you're probably finding at the moment where we're having a lot of really wet winters and very dry springs, which I think at the moment, seeing this for a couple of years now, is that it's playing havoc with what Josie was saying earlier about soils, because you get a lot of panning with the water, it hardens it up, and then it compacts, and then you end up having a very dry field where it's really hard for birds to kind of probe and feed. So it is a bit of a concern at the moment. So if we can do a few tweaks, we can potentially improve their habitats for birds in these sort of climate times. So hopefully this is what some of the wetlands are looking at the moment. You know, the bit sort of some nice splashes of water. I think lots of people get quite concerned when we say we're going to wet and flood fields, but when we mean wetting up, we just mean like 1 inch or 2 inches. You know, this was a good example, a really low spot in the field, filled up during the winter months, and as you can see, a nice flock of redshank, some godwits there, maybe some teal, and these are brilliant. You know, if we're able to maintain a lot of these just through using the natural topography of our sites, it's cheap and it's effective. And sometimes it just involves a few blocking of grips or drains to allow that to happen. And then it just gradually evaporates. And through transpiration, it will dry up, leaving some very good areas for lapwing to nest on, because they like the very bare mud and very short grass, as you can see there. And I think one of the most amazing iconic species now, you know, in massive declines, is the curlew. You know, the curlew, one of the largest waders that we have, and as you can see, it's nesting in this field which was been managed all last winter, and you can see that there's a few tussocks just in front of it, and that's what we're trying to achieve. We're not trying to manage this whole landscape into this linear sort of flat like grassland. We want some mosaic, and that's where cattle make this amazing habitat. And what also we can do is basically when sometimes, I mean, this might have even been left from a topper just going by and missing a bit. So it's just left a small area of high grassland where that curlew is nesting. And if you see the nest here, you see it's in some really nice tussocky areas. So it's all about variety, and key is variety and having it on a large scale. And we're just talking about lapwing. Lapwing now, they're tumbling from the skies. They have that really amazing call. This is a nice male where you can see that nice crest on the back of its head, and it is one of the most beautiful birds. And it is again, we've always got to look at the long term for waders. I mean, they live up to 30 years, so they need to produce enough offspring in that 30 years to sustain their population. So we need to be positive that if they get 3 or 4 good years off with clutches of 4 young, that's brilliant. And so basically it's really, really key to think that if you suddenly see a couple of bad years, we've got to see the 30-year trend of that individual bird. And lapwing are really unique because they always nest in the same spot or within a 1.5 kilometers from their original nesting area. And if chicks were hatched and they were successfully fledging this year, they would then nest within 1.5 kilometers of where they were brought up, and they would probably start nesting in the 3rd year of when they were brought up. So they're not going to nest straight away, and they will nest outside. So if you've got a really large field or a field where they're nesting, think that they might actually be nesting adjacent to where they were brought up. And lapwing are one of these species where they can nest anywhere. They nest in fields, they nest on islands, they nest on gravel, they nest on shingle. They have some species like wet mud, some feed on beaches. They're so varied to the very site specific of where they nest. So they nest in really wheat fields where at the moment they're just absolutely dry. They've had no water on them, but they're happily nesting there, and they'll find some insects and food somewhere. I mean, that's the beauty of it. They always find something. So it's really key that the species that are in those areas are unique to that individual spot. Or as for snipe, snipe are kind of like they're one of these species that actually has very, very fine nostrils on their end of their bill, and they need deep soils to probe in. Nice peat. They feed on species like leather jackets in the mud. They need mud, and they need a bit of tussocky areas to nest and to feed in. They like to hide away, as lapwing tend to feed and nest in large open short landscape. And with snipe, they're quite cool. So when they pair up, the male will drum. They have this drumming noise. And it's a bit like when you put a bit of paper over a comb and you blow it. And that's what the noise they're doing. But they're using their tail feathers to do that noise. And the male will do a big circuit around the field drumming. And then as when it gets closer, the actual circle gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And that's pretty much right above its nest. So that's the snipe. And when the snipe have youngsters, they basically, the mum takes 2, the dad takes 2, and they separate and they look after them individually. And waders are so unique in their livestock, the ecology of what they do, which I'll go into in a minute. So here we are in summer. So I thought we'd go through the seasons. So it's summertime, and we're supposed to be having lots of chicks around. This is an oyster catcher chick. I mean, oyster catchers, I don't know if you're familiar with oyster catchers, but they are probably one of the hardiest waders that we have. They're really territorial. They can really dive bomb you when you get close to a nest. They actually nest on roundabouts in the middle of Aberdeenshire, on the little mini roundabouts where the gravel is. So they do take advantage a lot of, and they also nest on grassy roofs. If people have got the sort of turf roofs, they'll actually nest on them. And I've seen them nesting on really high stumped pollard trees recently when I was in Newcastle. And wading chicks. So wading chicks are, when they're incubating their eggs, they incubate their eggs straight away. So, And the reason why they do that is so they can all hatch out at the same time. So like birds of prey, they incubate from the first egg, and that's when you suddenly get a runt of the brood, and one gets eaten or chucked out the nest. But here with waders, they all hatch at the same time, and within and the most vulnerable part of them hatching is the 35 to 40 hours of when they're pipping and trying to hatch out of the egg. That's when they're alerted predators, and they're really, really vulnerable at that time. As soon as they've hatched, within a few hours, their feathers they're dry. They'll be running around with their adults. They're completely mobile, which is the beauty of these wading species, is that they can move around with the adults, and they're basically feeding on insects, worms, and using a longer cover that's grown in the vegetation to hide. And when they see a predator, they just lie flat on the ground and they just stop there until the adults have stopped alarming, and then they'll get back to their feeding. And they even use hoof prints of the cattle to hide into it. So that's why it's really important. If you see breeding birds doing alarm calls, is not to go closer to see what they're doing, because there's probably chicks there lying on the ground hiding, and that's when there's really high risk of them getting squashed. And that's why we have to do cattle at certain densities and so forth. But the part of the with avocets and other with different waders and cattle is it's crucial, because some of the species actually adapted to cattle grazing. So cattle play a really important role at the right time. So when they're on nests and eggs, cattle probably should be restricted at other areas, but when they've got chicks, the cows will graze small paths and small areas for them to maneuver around, but it'll also disturb mud, and all of their and all the cattle using less ivermectins. They're just being, I don't know if you do that, but we used to go around with a bucket, collect the dung, work out if the cows needed worming, and they didn't, so we didn't worm them, which meant that there had more insects, and it really helped the soils, but also just promote the insects, which is absolutely vital. The more insects, the more successful the habitat is, and especially waders, because of the colder days now, the climate change, it's all throwing it out the sink with the seasons. So insects and worms and leather jackets are crucial to waders. So when they've got chicks, so for example, the chicks will be maneuvering around where the cattle are, and so because when the cattle are munching along the fields, they create short areas, long areas, and the actual chicks are walking around the areas that have been grazed. So it's a really fine balance, and this is why when you look at waders and monitor them and do all the things, it's knowing that right call to do the best you can. And sometimes at this time of year, it gets really, really hot. The grasses is getting stressed. If you put the cows out there too late, then the grass is not palatable for the cows, and then you've lost that thing, and then it flaps over in the large storms, and then you've just lost that whole sward. So I do understand it's an absolute challenge to choose the right time to do that. So, and that's where it kind of just needs a little bit of thought going into it, thinking, well, if I don't do it, the habitat in the grassland's going to be, it's just going to be turned into a real bad mess. I can do it now. I know they've got chicks about. I need to do it, otherwise it's going to be even worse to years to come. So there is a real fine line to it all. And I think this is and obviously keeping areas wet during these prolonged dry spells now is that we need to be really, really focused on how we can keep things wet. For example, can we use natural springs? Can we use natural ways of getting water into certain areas for birds to feed? Can we use solar pumps to abstract water out of a pond into some areas of splashes, like you can see on this slide here? And also you can see the slide to the right is a ditch, and as that's going down, you've got these lovely profiles where chicks can go into the mud and feed on the peaty edges. And that's really key, is having lots of different edges to a ditch or to a pond, because we can't predict the weather, we can't predict the temperatures, but the variety of edges that we have on ditches and ponds provide that nice warm temperature of about 12 to 15 degrees that absolutely make Daphne and other invertebrates thrive. It's a bit like going to a swimming pool. You sit at night, start off in a nice shallow end, it's lovely and beautifully warm, you get to the deep end, it's freezing cold. We want the warm stuff, the nice warm water to encourage all of the insects. Oh, there we go. Because if this is an example, there's a curlew, if you can see that in there. So that's getting into a lovely grassy field, but eventually that's going to get higher and higher, and then the birds are just going to be lost in that field. So obviously the key is to bring in these chaps, and it's getting that sward right, it's getting the hatching right, and it's like you say, it's about 1 hectare per cow. And sometimes it's worth having some cows put into one field before you go into that field, because sometimes you get some wild steers, they're a bit feisty and they always jump in the field and they charge around to see where the gates are, where all the fences are. It's worth having them put into one of a field, let them calm down, let them get used to the fresh grass, then move them into the waders are from there. And they are such a vital sort of management tool for waders, but they need to be used in the right way. And also with this, birds can move freely. I saw a pair of godwits and they moved 4 kilometers in 2 days on a wetland to escape sort of predation and predators. But we also talk about hares. Hares are always a good one. We don't always focus about birds, but I just want to put in there is that hares are always a good sign of a good grassland where you've got sort of short grass, tussocks, and so forth. And like we touched on insects. So this is elephant hawk moth, sort of one of the most iconic hawk moths that you get in the country, and it is key. So it's key to have cattle in there over a long period of time rather than very short periods of time, because at the end of the day we were sort of imitating what the large herbivores used to do before they went extinct. We want cattle to graze in one field, they eat the grass, they walk into a different area of a field, and they have a cow pat, and it's moving seeds around, it's moving insects around, and just like drove, that's what they're doing. That's what's really good for conservation, having big open landscapes, is that these species can move around and they can basically pass seeds around. And if we can try and use less herbicides, brings more insects. And it's very, very gentle, really sort of soft in management. I've worked in areas where we had compartments and prescribed prescriptions for management of cows, but we finally went to a point of, right, here's 80 cows, 80 calves, and we put them over 200 hectares of wetland and just let them do what they did. And it managed it for birds, it managed it for all the plants, all the insects, and for that long period of time it was perfect. And then eventually we went in and then and just looked at all the insects from there and all of the dung that they were doing. So it is, but it's all about, like I say, it's everything's different on everybody's different sites. But it's just looking at how can you make this a lot easier for you by having larger compartments and the operations of doing it as well for livestock, because I know it's never easy. And it's simply just walking through the fields. It's you walk through a field, you see all the insects coming off all of the plants, the grass and the swards. You look down, and if you look at a cow pat, and there's loads of like someone's put a knitting needle spikes in through all of the cow pat, that birds are feeding in the dung as well. You just know that there's a buzz of insects, and every year you do that because it's your bit of land, your bit of field. You get to see the good years, the bad years, how things could be changed. And then we go into autumn, and hay seasons, you make hay when the sun shines, and it's always a big thing of hay. I mean, things have changed in the last sort of 50 years. The machinery's got faster, it's got bigger, it's quick, and we've got to, and also with bigger fields to do that. So if for example fields can be done in quarter of a field, I understand that's always difficult with weather and operations and contracts and costs, but it's about doing small things in small areas to try and balance it, because when you're taking all of this away, you've taken the insects away, you're taking the voles away, and it's just trying to work out how you can kind of balance that, because you want high density of voles, because you want the foxes and the birds and all the things eating the voles, not eating the birds' eggs. So in the high Arctic, you always know when they've had a good breeding season of geese is because they've had a really good bump year of lemmings. So you see loads of juvenile geese coming back because, oh, you've had a good year of lemmings. And then the opposite, when there's not been a good population, the lemming population's failed. So it's invertebrates and voles are your foundations to waders. And here's an example. Yeah, so that's that. And then you get all of the grass. If you're just grazing it and then needing to top it, it's trying to make it palatable. You know, the cows only eat certain stuff. You know, they won't eat soft rush. They won't eat some of the sort of more stalkier plants, but you need to get rid of that to get a nice big fresh sprig of grass or rush for the cows to eat that, because that's both good for the grassland sward, but also good for the cows to put on weight for the last few months before the winter, but also for the cows and calves to produce better milk, so forth. So it's all about trying to manage it. And this was actually a field when someone was trying this little topper out on the used washes where I used to work, and they're all looking puzzled and looking excited about it. And it was literally just topping the unpalatable grass. So it was a very high cut, just getting rid of the stalky stuff, and then the cows would then come in and tidy it all up. They would mulch the cut stuff back into the grass, fertilizing it, and then they would keep on eating the short grass to get the finished product. So that's where we use a topper rather than a flail or a disc cutter. Another ways as well, simple, you know, it shows you that picture of a ditch there, but also, you know, if we do these projects, this is called a rotary ditcher, which I kind of boycotted for quite some time because I thought, well, it creates this complete linear and unique low areas, which has no uniqueness. Like a digger can create these lovely edges, variety, but this machine just creates one big bowl. I'm hoping it's going to work. Oh, it would work if it was on the right way. And it's literally going along, and it's basically chucking the soil, throwing it out. Oh, you know, and literally that's chucking it 300 meters out the way, and that's called a rotary ditcher. And it's a really unique bit of equipment where it takes away the sort of topsoil, it throws it away, and it can create some lovely grips that can take water to lower areas, or it can create low areas of water if you haven't got that on site. All right for time. And obviously the digger here. So this is kind of like a bit of a fen landscape. This was all previously farmland, which are created many years ago. And you can see they've got ditches, tussocky grassland, you've got wetland splashes, and even all this bare mud that you can see on the slide to the right that's really good for lapwing. And ditch clearance is not only good for doing it in small areas and small lengths, but it's also really good that when you do it, that lapwing actually associate the slubbings that you come out of the ditch, they actually nest in it because it's perfect habitat for waders and oyster catchers as well. So so some of the mechanical operations that we've done all those for generations, actually birds have adapted to some of them as well. Winter, a long way away, thankfully. Trees and structures. So waders don't tend to nest near trees within 300 or 400 meters away from trees because of the crows that will sit and perch on them. So don't try and think waders will be in this sort of habitat. Unfortunately, given that area, trees will deter waders from nesting there. But it's fine because it creates a buffer zone. You'll have voles in there. You'll have other dryland species like skylarks. You'll get tree sparrows. You'll get all the finches. And it's just a really good bit of habitat. So don't think it's not useless because it's probably buffering some other species that would necessarily go and eat your waders. So it's about, and it's all about trying to create that variety and sort of all species trying to live in harmony as best they can, given all of the pressures that we have to do in conservation now. Sorry, so this was one area where this has been intensively managed, and I walked over this when was it, in March, and there wasn't a bird in there at all. there wasn't a skylark singing, there wasn't lapwing, there wasn't curlew. And I think, you know, it's just looked perfect for it all. But I think something's not right going why that is, and whether that's, I don't know what it could be, but there's probably numerous examples. But it's just saying that sometimes you just got to create a bit of variety, you know, a bit of the sort of rushy areas, a few ponds in there. You know, if you was a bird flying over there, it probably didn't look very appetizing. But if you stuck a series of ponds in different places, let a bit of rough area came in, and you got some birds just using that area, birds then bring other birds in. So it's really useful just trying to think, how can I make this land look attractive for birds passing through? And it's all about trying to do very simple things to get these birds on here. And it's, you know, if you roll up into a countryside stewardship scheme, and you just have species rich grassland, I think it's like £200 £200 a hectare. If you're able to get it into wader habitat and get waders, it's £900 a hectare you get off countryside stewardship. So there's a really value money there that can really help support waders in the landscape and to support them, but also trying to get people and the neighbours to also do the same, because you all have to work together. From working from the fens, I worked with a lot of farmers who had intensive arable land, we had grassland, and it's just trying to work with them the best to mark out lapwing nests, or try to not roll it at this time of year, or trying to just lift the drill up when you go past it. Small things make such a big difference, and with the populations of waders now for lapwing oyster catchers, you know, 5 pairs, it's a massive, you know, massive bonus to the whole population of the UK, because we're all trying to work together in the UK just to get these species, and everyone does their bit, then hopefully we start winning the that. So here's another, sorry, it's all flat. And you know, ditches don't have to be straight. And that, as we were talking about putting manure onto fields, this was done before the breeding season, but you can see that you can't really see, you know, it's just literally gone out there, put some organic manure in to get the soils as good as they can. And this is to encourage for invertebrates. And it's leather jackets, which are the key. And like I say, it's all about shallow water, not big flooding. It's all about shallow water, and this really helps suppress a lot of the weeds, a lot of the rushes, and provides bare areas of ground for breeding birds. And it looks so attractive when birds are flying over from you. So I created a few ponds in Herefordshire, and already within that first year, they had a glossy ibis, they had some curlew passing over, they had some redshank, 50 linnets, load of passage finches, and loads of wintering snipe on there as well, just by creating some new ponds in the landscape of Herefordshire. So getting a few things right and doing it right, you can suddenly change so much. And they might be just using it as a stopping off point, stop when they're migrating over to where they're from. But then ponds have helped fuel them birds to get to their end destination, and we were just all part of passing that bird's baton like a relay race to get them to the best possible position with food, habitat, and then migration. And it's really good. I mean, with the work you do for waders in the wintertime, you get to enjoy lots of barn owls, and that's always a good thing because it's very similar habitat management for enjoying barn owls in your landscape and fields. That's me. Sorry if that was I'll just stop my screen now.
No need to say sorry, Lee. That was brilliant. Yeah, really informative. Thank you so much for that. I think we've gained loads out of that, everyone who's listened. It is 8 o'clock, so feel free to leave if you need to, but hopefully, Lee, if you can just stop for like 5 minutes to answer a few questions. We've got one in the chat from Annie, and she said, can we create a curlew friendly habitat, or and widely more wader friendly habitat with low density sheep grazing rather than cattle? Because you mentioned quite a lot about cattle there. Yeah, great question, Annie. Lee, I'll open it up to you.
Yeah, so yeah, we use a lot of sheep after hay cutting. So if you do a hay cut, we use sheep after that to keep the sward down pretty short. But also we don't do any topping it. So to keep money down as well, is that some fields we didn't want to top again in the wintertime add more money. So we use sheep to graze it down and to tidy it up, ready for the spring. So you can use sheep after the breeding bird season, but because of the way they graze and the way they are, they're not that good on for waders during the breeding season.
Okay, brilliant. And then Naomi's got a question linking to what you said earlier. So should cattle be on some land before July? So I guess during the breeding bird season, outside of when they're off the nest, they've hatched, and they're wandering around as little ones.
Yeah, so lapwing and certain birds always have like alarm calls when they've got chicks. So when you do a bird survey, you can walk around and you kind of know when they've got nests or eggs or they've got chicks through doing bird surveys. So when you know that they've got these alarm, they go really crazy. They alarm call, they fly over and dive by me head and everything else. You know they got chicks. So that's when you can start thinking allowing small densities of livestock into that field, because they need the cows to motivate the invertebrates. They need to get the swards into to sort of a different mosaic for birds to move around, because birds, it's a bit like trying to walk through like a 3 foot nettle and thistle bed when you're trying to get to A to B. And it's an absolute nightmare to do that. And you can imagine that's the same for wader chicks in long grass. That's why you need that cattle to squash, move things around, but also their dung. And I think their dung is really important. And even though we're supposed to like worm them every 17 weeks and do this, and obviously the cows and livestock get quite immune to some of these drugs now, is actually worming them when the cows need it. I mean, cows are pretty sound anyway, but the calves, you don't lose any weight from it, but it's quite an important part, is getting them cows to chomp on it.
Yeah, brilliant. I just want to make a point that I thought that was really interesting how you mentioned, about the farmyard manure applications. You've done it kind of just before the breeding bird season, and I mentioned about autumn time's probably better. As you said, every site's different and the habitat's different. If you're not making hay and you're simply grazing those areas, I feel like applying farmyard manure in the spring, really getting that boost of organic matter in just as they're trying to feed. Is really beneficial. So I think it's all about, would you say, taking time, assessing your area, and just taking your time with it, not rushing in.
Yeah, it's just understanding it. Even I don't understand everything these days on all the birds. They all have their uniqueness to their individual areas and fields of what you're doing. You might be doing absolutely fantastic. You're doing brilliant. It's great. But you're always learning something about the species, and the way we are now with the climate, it's always changing. When you do things when you need to do it, that doesn't work. It is so difficult, and that's why waders, I think, are really challenging. And it's just really important just to kind of take a step back, think about it a bit, and just think, okay, and just if you've got waders, is just see other sites and speak to other people, because that's so key. That is, we learn so much, and I know I'm going to the Derwent Valley next week to have a look around there, and I've been up to your part of the world a bit as well. And it's just getting more of an understanding of it. So I'm just a tourist, I'm not here to kind of dictate how you guys manage your site. It's just these are the things I've learned, and we're always learning, but I know it's really hard. So
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Lee. I'm just going to quickly run through a final few slides so can you see that? Yeah.
yes.
So, thank you so much for that, Lee. And how can Nidderdale National Landscape help anybody who's listening? Well, we've been doing grassland restoration projects for the last 15 years, and I can help come all for free, do soil sampling, vegetation surveys, help create your site-specific management plans, organize contractors and help manage the ongoing management of your site through restoration, and provide ongoing support. And this is all for free. So if you have a grassland and you want to manage it better for nature and waders specifically, get in touch with me. My phone number and email address is there, but our comms officer will send out an email to everyone. Next, coming up on the 11th of May, we'll be discussing grassland management for invertebrates with a guest speaker, Rachel from Bug Life. and I think that'll be really, really interesting. And our tickets will be available on the National Landscape website. There's a whole host of resource sheets which these webinars have been influenced by. If you've missed anything today, or you want to learn about some of the topics that you might have missed previously, you can go onto our website and search for these resource sheets. They're constantly being updated from everything that we learn. So yeah, watch this space. They're really good and informative. Your feedback is key. You'll receive an email with a feedback form. If you can just fill that in, it should only take 5-10 minutes, and you can give your voice on the sorts of webinars you want to see into the future as well. So thank you very much for listening, everyone, and we can end it there. So yeah, as I said, thank you, Lee, again for giving up your time. That was really, really interesting. And I can definitely update our resource sheet with all that stuff I've learned.
No, thank you.
Thanks for joining, everyone.